It all started with a letter, a plain white envelope, slipped under our front door like a ghost in the night. I picked it up, curious at first. Maybe it was an invitation to another neighborhood event, or a friendly note from the HOA welcoming us once again. But when I opened it and read the words inside, my heart sank. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Alvarez," it began. The tone was polite but distant, as if written by someone who didn't care about us personally but wanted to sound official. After careful review by the Willow Creek Homeowners Association Board, we regret to inform you that your extended family members are no longer permitted to visit your property. I blinked, sure I'd misunderstood. My parents. Banned? It felt surreal, almost comical. What could they possibly have done wrong? They were quiet, loving people. My dad, Judge Luis Alvarez, and my mom, Rosa. They came to visit every few months, bringing laughter, stories, and home-cooked meals. Their visits were always peaceful. How could anyone complain? The letter went on to explain. Repeated complaints regarding noise violations, parking infractions, and general disruption to the neighborhood standards have forced this decision. Noise violations. Disruption. I stared at those words, trying to make sense of them. My parents weren't loud. They didn't throw parties or blast music. The only noise I could think of was their occasional habit of laughing together while sitting on the porch. Was that really too much for Willow Creek? When I showed the letter to Alina, my wife, her face turned pale. She read it twice, then looked at me with wide eyes. "This can't be happening," she whispered. "They can't do this." But they could, and they had. That evening, I called my dad. He was staying at a nearby hotel during his visit, just like always. When he answered the phone, his voice was calm, the same steady tone he used in court, but there was something sharp beneath it. "What's going on?" he asked. I told him everything. About the letter, the accusations, the absurdity of banning two elderly people from visiting their own son's house. By the time I finished, there was silence on the other end of the line. For a moment, I thought he might laugh it off or tell me not to worry. Instead, he said quietly, "They've made a grave error." His words sent a chill through me. This wasn't just about rules anymore. This was personal. The next morning, Dad arrived at our house early. He carried a briefcase, which seemed odd since he was supposed to be on vacation. As he sat down at our kitchen table, he pulled out copies of documents, HOA bylaws, local ordinances, even notes he'd taken after researching online late into the night. "They think they can push us around," he said, tapping one of the papers. "But they don't understand who they're dealing with." Alina watched him nervously. "Louis, please don't do anything drastic," she pleaded. "We'll figure this out. Maybe we can talk to them. Explain." "No," he interrupted firmly. "Talking won't work here. These people don't want understanding. They want control, and they'll keep pushing until someone stops them." He paused, looking directly at me. "Do you trust me?" I nodded without hesitation. Of course I trusted him. He was my father, a man whose entire career was built on fairness and justice. If anyone could handle this, it was him. With that, he reached for the phone and dialed a number. "Get me the county commissioner," he said sharply. "We need to talk." As I watched him, a mix of emotions swirled inside me. Anger, fear, pride. Whatever happened next, one thing was certain. The HOA had picked the wrong family to mess with. The weight of what was happening began to settle over our household like a storm cloud. My father, Judge Luis Alvarez, wasn't the type to let anything slide. Not injustice, not unfairness, and certainly not something as personal as this. Seeing him take charge felt both comforting and terrifying at the same time. Comforting because I knew he wouldn't back down. Terrifying because I had no idea where this fight might lead. That first morning after the letter arrived, Dad transformed into a version of himself I hadn't seen in years, the determined, unyielding judge who commanded respect in any room he entered. He spread out papers across our dining table, his glasses perched low on his nose as he read through every line of the HOA's bylaws. His brows furrowed deeper with each paragraph, and occasionally he'd mutter under his breath, "This is absurd." Alina hovered nearby, wringing her hands. "Louis," she said hesitantly, "are you sure about this? What if it makes things worse?" He didn't look up from the documents. "Worse how?" he asked, his tone calm but firm. "They've already banned me and Rosa from visiting my own son's home. What more can they do?" She opened her mouth to respond but closed it again, unable to argue. Still, I could see the worry in her eyes. This wasn't just about winning or losing. It was about protecting our family and ourselves from whatever consequences might come next. Later that day, Dad called another meeting with the county commissioner. This time, I sat beside him, listening intently as he laid out his case. His voice was steady, commanding, but there was an edge to it, a quiet anger simmering beneath the surface. "These so-called rules," he explained, "aren't just unreasonable. They're discriminatory. And if they're allowed to stand, it sets a dangerous precedent for everyone else in this community." The commissioner listened carefully, nodding along. "Judge Alvarez," he said finally, "you have my full attention. But understand, this isn't going to be easy. The HOA has deep pockets and powerful connections." Dad leaned forward, his expression unwavering. "I'm aware of that," he replied. "But I'm also aware of the law. And the law doesn't allow organizations to pick and choose who belongs based on arbitrary standards. If we don't challenge this now, they'll only grow bolder." By the end of the call, the commissioner agreed to investigate further. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was a start. As Dad hung up the phone, he turned to me with a small, satisfied smile. "We're moving forward," he said simply. Word spread quickly around Willow Creek. Neighbors whispered behind closed doors, some curious, others hostile. Some even stopped us in the street to ask what was going on. "Is it true your dad is taking on the HOA?" one woman asked, wide-eyed. I nodded, unsure whether to feel proud or embarrassed. At school drop-off the next morning, Alina noticed people staring at her. She tried to brush it off, telling herself it was all in her head. But when she returned home, she found a note tucked under our windshield wiper. "You're making a big mistake." Her hands trembled as she showed it to me. "What does this mean?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Are they threatening us?" I clenched my fists, furious. Who did these people think they were? But before I could respond, Dad stepped in. "It means they're scared," he said firmly. "Scared because they know they're wrong. And when people are scared, they lash out." Despite his reassurance, the tension in our house grew thicker with each passing day. Even the kids seemed to sense it, tiptoeing around and speaking in softer tones. Dinner conversations revolved around updates from Dad's meetings with lawyers and county officials. Every new development brought a mix of hope and anxiety. One evening, as we sat together in the living room, Alina broke the silence. "Do you ever wonder if this is worth it?" she asked softly. "If maybe we should just try to work with them instead of fighting." Dad set his cup of coffee down and looked at her. "Alina," he said gently, "sometimes doing the right thing means standing your ground, even when it's hard. These people need to learn that power isn't about control. It's about fairness. And if we walk away now, what message does that send?" She didn't answer right away, but after a long pause, she nodded. "Okay," she said quietly. "Let's keep going." As the days turned into weeks, I realized something important. This fight wasn't just about my parents being banned from visiting. It was about sending a message to the HOA, to the neighborhood, and to ourselves, that some lines couldn't be crossed. No matter how much pressure they applied, we weren't backing down. Not now. Not ever. The tension in Willow Creek reached a boiling point faster than anyone expected. Word of my father's challenge to the HOA spread like wildfire, dividing the neighborhood into two clear camps. Some residents secretly cheered us on, emboldened by our defiance, but too afraid to speak up themselves. Others glared at us with thinly veiled hostility, their disapproval radiating whenever we passed them on the street. It was impossible not to notice the change. Neighbors who once waved hello now avoided eye contact. Cars slowed down as they drove past our house, drivers craning their necks to catch a glimpse of what was happening. Even the mailman hesitated before dropping off packages, as if being associated with us might put him under scrutiny. It felt like living inside a fishbowl, except the water was murky, and everyone outside was waiting for us to drown. At the next HOA meeting, emotions ran high. The clubhouse buzzed with murmurs as people filed in, some clutching copies of the infamous letter that had started it all. Mr. Grayson stood at the podium, his usual smug demeanor replaced by something sharper, nervousness, maybe even fear. He cleared his throat and began speaking, his voice louder than usual, as if trying to project confidence he didn't feel. "Let's be clear," he announced, glaring directly at me. "This community thrives because of its standards. We cannot allow external influences to undermine them." His words hung heavy in the air, dripping with accusation. I couldn't stay silent any longer. I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor. "External influences," I shot back, my voice steady despite the knot tightening in my stomach. "You're talking about my parents, elderly citizens who've done nothing wrong." The room erupted into murmurs. Some nodded in agreement, others sneered or whispered behind cupped hands. Mr. Grayson raised a hand for silence, but before he could respond, the doors burst open. In walked my father, Judge Luis Alvarez, flanked by two men in suits, his lawyer, and a representative from the county commissioner's office. The room fell silent instantly. All eyes turned to him as he strode to the front, his presence commanding absolute attention. If there was ever a moment when I fully understood why people called him Your Honor, it was then. "Mr. Grayson," Dad began, his voice ringing with authority, "you may run this association, but you operate within the confines of the law. And the law does not permit discrimination against lawful visitors." Grayson sputtered, attempting to defend himself. "We're simply enforcing the rules," he protested. "Rules agreed upon by every homeowner here." Dad cut him off with a sharp look. "Enforcing rules is one thing. Abusing them is another. Your actions violate zoning laws designed to protect residents' rights. If you persist, legal action will follow." The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Grayson's face flushed red, but he didn't argue further. Instead, he glanced nervously at the board members seated beside him, searching for support. They shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding his gaze. After the meeting, chaos erupted. Neighbors gathered in clusters outside the clubhouse, debating what had just happened. Some defended the HOA, insisting that rules were necessary to maintain order. Others sided with us, calling the ban on my parents ridiculous and cruel. Arguments broke out, voices rising until someone shouted, "Enough." Later that night, as we sat around the kitchen table discussing the fallout, Alina sighed heavily. "I didn't realize it would get this bad," she admitted. "People are choosing sides. It's tearing the neighborhood apart." "It already was torn apart," Dad replied firmly. "We're just exposing the cracks they tried to hide." He was right. Beneath Willow Creek's polished surface lay resentment, fear, and division. By standing up to the HOA, we weren't just fighting for ourselves. We were forcing everyone else to confront the truth. Rules meant to create harmony had been weaponized to control and exclude. And now, thanks to my father's determination, there was no turning back. As I looked at him sitting there, calm and resolute, I realized something. This wasn't just about winning or losing. It was about courage, the kind that inspires others to stand up too. Whatever came next, I knew we were ready. The days following the explosive HOA meeting felt like living in the eye of a storm. Everything seemed eerily calm on the surface, but beneath it, tensions simmered and alliances shifted. Neighbors who once avoided us now approached cautiously, their curiosity outweighing their fear of being seen talking to the troublemakers. Some offered quiet words of support, while others simply stared, unsure of what to say. Word spread quickly that my father, Judge Luis Alvarez, wasn't backing down, and neither was the county commissioner. The HOA scrambled to regain control, holding emergency meetings almost daily. But without their usual authority, they floundered. Their attempts to negotiate with us were laughable. They offered compromises, reversing the ban on my parents, reducing fines, even proposing vague promises of reform. But Dad wouldn't budge. "This isn't about bargaining," he told me one evening as we sat at the dining table surrounded by stacks of legal documents. "It's about accountability. If we let them off easy, they'll slide back into old habits. No deals. No exceptions." Alina watched him nervously, her fingers twisting the edge of a napkin. "What if they retaliate?" she asked softly. "What if things get worse?" "They already tried that," I reminded her, gesturing toward the anonymous notes and icy stares we'd endured. "And it didn't work." Dad placed a reassuring hand over hers. "Sometimes, Alina, doing the right thing means risking everything. But trust me, this fight is bigger than us. It's about protecting people from tyranny disguised as order." Despite her doubts, she nodded. We all knew there was no turning back now. The battle lines had been drawn, and every move mattered. Then came the final blow, a moment that changed everything. During a televised county hearing, Dad presented damning evidence of the HOA's misconduct. Leaked emails revealed discriminatory practices, financial mismanagement, and outright bullying tactics used against homeowners who dared question their rules. The crowd gasped as he laid out each accusation, his arguments sharp and irrefutable. One email stood out, a message from Mr. Grayson himself instructing board members to make an example of families who resisted compliance. Another detailed how certain residents were targeted for minor infractions, while others received preferential treatment. It was clear the HOA wasn't just enforcing rules. They were wielding power selectively, creating fear to maintain control. As Dad spoke, I glanced around the room. Faces reflected shock, anger, and even shame. Many attendees lived in Willow Creek themselves, yet none of this had ever been visible behind the neighborhood's polished facade. When the gavel finally struck, declaring the association officially disbanded pending restructuring, cheers erupted from the gallery. Justice had been served, but the victory wasn't without cost. As we left the courthouse, reporters swarmed us, shoving microphones in our faces and firing questions faster than we could answer. Cameras flashed, capturing my father's stern expression and Alina's weary smile. For the first time, I realized how public this fight had become, and how much attention it had drawn not just locally, but across the state. That night, as we gathered in the living room, exhaustion settled over us like a heavy blanket. The kids fell asleep early, drained by the whirlwind of events. Even Dad, usually unshakable, looked tired. Yet there was a sense of relief in the air, a weight lifted after months of relentless pressure. "We did it," Alina said quietly, breaking the silence. Her voice trembled with emotion. "But at what cost?" Dad sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Change always comes at a price," he replied. "But if we hadn't stood up, nothing would have changed. Sometimes you have to burn something down to build something better." His words lingered in the stillness, echoing through the house. Outside, the streets of Willow Creek lay quiet under the moonlight. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, rebuilding trust, healing divisions, finding a way forward. But for tonight, we allowed ourselves to breathe. The HOA's reign was over, and though scars remained, hope flickered faintly on the horizon. The aftermath of the HOA's dissolution hit Willow Creek like a tidal wave. For years, the neighborhood had been governed by strict rules and rigid expectations, enforced with an iron fist. Now, suddenly, there was no one at the helm. The absence of authority left a void, a strange mix of freedom and uncertainty that rippled through every corner of the community. At first, chaos reigned. Without the HOA to dictate what color houses should be painted or how lawns should look, some residents took liberties they'd never dared before. A family on Oak Drive installed a bright pink fence around their yard, sparking heated debates among neighbors. Another household parked an old RV in their driveway permanently, ignoring complaints from those who preferred pristine streets. It felt like Pandora's box had been opened, unleashing years of pent-up frustration and rebellion. But not everyone embraced the newfound freedom. Some homeowners grew anxious, worried that the neighborhood would descend into disarray without someone to maintain order. What happens if people stop caring altogether? One woman asked during a tense gathering at the park. Willow Creek won't feel like home anymore. My father listened quietly as these conversations unfolded. He understood the concerns but also knew this period of adjustment was necessary. Change is messy, he told me one evening as we walked through the neighborhood. People are used to being told what to do. Learning to govern themselves will take time. Despite his calm demeanor, Dad remained vigilant. The HOA board members, desperate to regain control, began whispering about appeals and lawsuits. Mr. Grayson, in particular, couldn't let go of his pride or his power. One afternoon, he approached me as I was mowing the lawn. Gone was his usual arrogance. Instead, he looked weary, almost defeated. I underestimated you, he admitted gruffly, shuffling his feet. And your father. I turned off the mower, studying him carefully. His words seemed genuine, though tinged with regret. It wasn't about winning, I said finally. It was about fairness. Something you should have understood from the beginning. Grayson nodded slowly, then walked away without another word. Watching him leave, I felt no triumph, only relief. Perhaps, deep down, he realized the damage his leadership had caused. Meanwhile, Elena and I worked to rebuild relationships within the neighborhood. We invited neighbors over for coffee, encouraging open conversations about how to move forward. Slowly, trust began to return. Families started sharing stories of their own struggles under the HOA. Fines for harmless infractions, threats of legal action, even outright humiliation. It became clear that our fight hadn't just been personal. It had exposed systemic issues affecting countless others. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, my parents joined us. My dad leaned back in his chair, sipping tea while my mom hummed softly. The kids played in the yard, their laughter filling the air. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace, not perfection, but progress. You know, Dad said thoughtfully, breaking the silence, this place has potential. If people focus on kindness instead of control, Willow Creek could become something truly special. Elena smiled, leaning her head on my shoulder. That's up to all of us now. As darkness fell and fireflies danced in the distance, I realized he was right. The scars of the past wouldn't fade overnight, but hope was taking root. Willow Creek wasn't perfect anymore, but maybe it didn't need to be. Maybe it just needed to be free. Months after the HOA's fall, Willow Creek began to transform in ways no one could have predicted. The neighborhood wasn't perfect. It likely never would be. But it was finding its rhythm again. Without the constant pressure of rigid rules and judgmental oversight, people started to relax. Laughter returned to the streets, and neighbors who had once avoided each other began reconnecting. Still, the scars ran deep. Some friendships were beyond repair, fractured by years of resentment and fear. Others, though strained, showed signs of healing as people worked to rebuild trust. It wasn't easy. Conversations often turned awkward when old grievances bubbled to the surface. But slowly, tentatively, the community started coming together, not because someone forced them to, but because they wanted to. One crisp autumn afternoon, a group of us gathered at the park for an impromptu cleanup day. Families brought snacks, kids played tag, and volunteers raked leaves and picked up trash. It was a small gesture, but symbolic, a reminder that Willow Creek belonged to all of us, not just a select few. As I worked alongside my neighbors, I noticed how much lighter everyone seemed. Gone was the tension that used to hang over every interaction. In its place was something fragile yet hopeful: unity. But even amid this progress, reminders of the past lingered. One day, while walking home from the store, I spotted Mr. Grayson sitting alone on a bench near the pond. He looked older somehow, his shoulders slumped and his usual confidence replaced by weariness. Against my better judgment, I approached him. "Mind if I sit?" I asked cautiously. He glanced up, surprised, then nodded. "Go ahead," he muttered, shifting slightly to make room. We sat in silence for a moment, watching ducks paddle across the water. Finally, I spoke. "How are you holding up?" Grayson sighed, rubbing his temples. "Honestly, not great. I thought I was doing what was best for this place, for everyone. Turns out I was just blind." His honesty caught me off guard. For so long, I'd seen him as the enemy, the face of everything wrong with the HOA. But now, sitting beside him, I saw something else. A man grappling with regret. "You tried to keep things under control," I said carefully. "But sometimes control isn't the answer. People need freedom to make mistakes, and to learn from them." He nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I guess I learned it the hard way." We didn't talk much longer, but as I walked away, I felt a strange sense of closure. Maybe forgiveness wasn't too far out of reach. For him, and for all of us. Back at home, Elena and I reflected on how far we'd come. Our kids laughed in the backyard, tossing a ball back and forth, blissfully unaware of the battles fought on their behalf. My parents visited more often now, their presence filling the house with warmth and stories. Life had returned to a steadier pace, though the memory of the fight remained etched in our minds. One evening, as we sat around the dining table sharing dinner, Dad raised his glass. "To new beginnings," he said, his voice warm but tinged with pride. "And to standing up for what's right, even when it's hard." We clinked glasses, smiling despite the challenges we'd faced. Willow Creek still had its quirks and imperfections, but it was ours now, not controlled by fear or favoritism, but shaped by the people who called it home. And in that shared ownership lay a quiet kind of triumph. The HOA may have been gone, but its legacy lived on, not as a symbol of oppression, but as a lesson in resilience. We had taken a stand, not just for ourselves, but for the future of our neighborhood. And though the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, we were ready to face it together. Months turned into a year, and Willow Creek continued to evolve. The neighborhood wasn't the same polished picture it had been under the HOA's iron grip, but in many ways, it was better. Brightly painted mailboxes dotted the streets, flower gardens burst with colors that didn't match any approved palette, and kids played freely without worrying about disturbing someone's peace. It was messy, imperfect, and alive. Exactly what a community should be. As I sat on my porch one evening, sipping coffee and watching the sun dip below the horizon, I thought about everything we'd been through. The fight against the HOA had tested us in ways I never imagined. It pushed our family to its limits, forced us to confront neighbors we once trusted, and left scars that might never fully heal. But it also taught us something invaluable: the power of standing up for what's right, even when the odds feel insurmountable. My father joined me, settling into the chair beside mine. He looked older now, his hair streaked with more gray than before, but his eyes still carried that familiar spark of determination. "Do you think it was worth it?" he asked, echoing a question Elena had posed months ago. I took a long sip of coffee, letting the warmth spread through me as I considered his words. "Yes," I said finally. "It wasn't just about us, or even about Mom and you being banned. It was about showing people they don't have to live in fear. That fairness matters more than rules." He nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Justice always comes at a cost," he'd go. "But if we hadn't stood up, who would have? Sometimes the hardest fights are the ones worth fighting." His voice softened, and for a moment, He seemed lost in thought. "You know," he continued, "when I first read that letter banning us from visiting, I felt anger, but also sadness. Sadness for a place that had forgotten how to be human. Rules can guide us, but they shouldn't define us. Not completely." I glanced over at him, struck by the weight of his words. Growing up, I'd admired his strength and integrity, but seeing him navigate this battle had deepened my respect for him. He wasn't just a judge. He was a man who believed in fairness, not just in courtrooms, but in life itself. The sound of laughter interrupted my thoughts. My kids were playing tag in the yard with their cousins, their shouts mingling with the chirping of crickets. Belina stepped outside, carrying a tray of cookies fresh from the oven. She set them down on the table between us and smiled. "For later," she said simply, her tone lighter than it had been in months. Watching her, I realized how much she'd endured throughout this ordeal. Her worry lines had softened, replaced by a quiet confidence. We weren't the same family we'd been a year ago. We were stronger, closer, and more united because of everything we'd faced together. Later that night, as I tucked the kids into bed, my daughter looked up at me with wide eyes. "Dad," she asked, "are we safe here now?" Her question caught me off guard, but I knelt beside her bed and smiled. "Yes, sweetheart, we're safe, and we'll always stand up for what's right, no matter what." She nodded sleepily, snuggling deeper under her blanket. As I turned off the light, I felt a surge of gratitude. For her innocence, for our home, and for the lessons we learned along the way. Back downstairs, Dad was packing up his briefcase, preparing to head back to his hotel. Before he left, he paused at the door and turned to me. "Remember this, son. Freedom isn't given, it's taken. And sometimes, it's protected by standing firm when others try to take it away." With that, he walked out into the cool night air, leaving behind a legacy of courage and resilience. As I locked the door behind him, I felt a profound sense of peace. Willow Creek wasn't perfect, but it was ours. And thanks to the fight we'd wage, it was a place where kindness mattered more than control, and where every family, no matter how different, could belong. The HOA may have tried to divide us, but in the end, they only made us stronger. Together, we had reclaimed not just our neighborhood, but our humanity. And that, I knew, was a victory worth celebrating.